When the cameras found Michael Douglas standing before them, there was an expectation of composure, the familiar armor of a man who has survived decades in Hollywood without ever letting the cracks show. He has faced cancer, public scandal, and the long erosion of fame with a stoic grace that made him appear unbreakable. Yet the man who spoke that day did not look carved from stone. He looked exhausted, stripped of certainty, carrying a weight that no award or legacy could counterbalance. His voice was steady, but something in the pauses betrayed a deeper rupture. He was not there to perform grief. He was there to tell a truth that had been buried for years. The name that brought him to that moment was Rob Reiner, a figure the public thought it understood, a beloved filmmaker, a man associated with warmth, humor, and humanity. Headlines had already reduced the story to a familiar pattern: a tragic death, a troubled son, a sudden explosion of violence that no one could have foreseen. It was a narrative easy to digest because it asked nothing of the audience except sympathy. Douglas made it clear from his first breath that this version of events was dangerously incomplete. What happened was not sudden. It was not inexplicable. And it was not, in his view, inevitable. He spoke not as a commentator, but as a witness, someone who had stood close enough to see the slow collapse from the inside. Their bond went beyond professional respect. They were bound by parallel lives shaped under impossible shadows, both born to legendary fathers, both spending their adult years trying to build identities that belonged to them alone. They shared an understanding of what it meant to succeed publicly while failing privately, of how applause can coexist with a silence at home that grows heavier every year. When Douglas described Reiner, he did not talk about box office numbers or iconic films. He talked about a man who was tired, a man whose laughter had faded long before his life ended. The most chilling moment came when Douglas revealed that he had tried to stop this long ago. A decade earlier, he had looked his friend in the eye and said something that felt almost heretical. He warned him that unconditional love, when paired with fear and denial, could become lethal. It was a sentence that seemed to contradict everything society teaches about family. Yet Douglas delivered it without hesitation. He did not frame it as wisdom discovered in hindsight. He framed it as a warning that had gone unheeded, one that now echoed with unbearable clarity. As he spoke, the room seemed to contract around the idea that love alone is not always salvation. Douglas described a household governed not by violence in the obvious sense, but by tension, by constant negotiation, by the quiet terror of setting boundaries that might provoke disaster. He painted a picture of a father who had lost command of his own home, not because he was weak, but because he was afraid of doing the one thing he believed would destroy his child. In that fear, authority eroded. In that erosion, danger took root. Douglas did not dramatize his words. He did not raise his voice. The power of his testimony lay in its restraint. He spoke of moments when he chose distance, not out of indifference, but because watching the situation unfold had become unbearable. He recognized patterns because he had lived through his own version of them. He knew what it meant to lie awake at night, waiting for a phone call that could end everything. He knew the cost of decisions that feel cruel in the moment but are made in the hope of survival. The difference, he implied without cruelty, was that one of them had been able to make those decisions, and the other had not. What unsettled listeners most was the implication that this tragedy had accomplices beyond the walls of the house. Douglas hinted at a culture that normalizes dysfunction when it comes wrapped in privilege. A culture that looks away, that softens reality with excuses, that confuses discretion with decency. In his account, silence was not neutral. It was active. It allowed patterns to deepen, behaviors to escalate, and illusions to persist long after they should have shattered. By the time he paused, the story had already shifted. This was no longer about a shocking end. It was about a slow surrender that had taken place over years, hidden behind smiles and reputations. Douglas did not ask for forgiveness on behalf of his friend, nor did he ask for mercy for those responsible. He asked for honesty. He asked the audience to sit with the discomfort of a truth that refuses easy consolation. As his words lingered in the air, one thing became clear. This was not an obituary. It was the opening chapter of a reckoning that would not allow anyone, least of all Hollywood itself, to look away again. Michael Douglas is often seen as the resilient face of Hollywood, the man who overcame cancer and survived some of the most publicly scrutinized family crises in history. With a career spanning over 50 years, he has battled through personal turmoil and public tragedies, building a name for himself that is as strong as the legacies of his legendary father, Kirk Douglas. Yet the Michael Douglas that came forward recently, speaking about his dear friend Rob Reiner's death, was not the polished patriarch nor the seasoned actor we all know. Instead, it was a broken man, a friend devastated by the loss of someone he considered family. Rob Reiner's passing was tragic, but the narrative surrounding it was often oversimplified, painted with broad strokes of a troubled son and a tragic end. However, what Michael Douglas revealed about the last years of Rob's life challenged the conventional narrative and forced everyone to confront a far more painful truth, one that no one was ready to acknowledge. The dynamic within the Reiner family was far more complex, far more tragic than anyone had realized. Douglas spoke candidly about his relationship with Rob, revealing that they shared more than just a professional bond. Both were sons of Hollywood legends. Both had spent their lives in the shadow of their fathers, and both struggled with the burden of their family legacies. But it was their children that connected them on a much deeper, more painful level. Michael understood firsthand what it was like to have a child who spirals out of control, a child who becomes a shadow of the person they were meant to be. His own son, Cameron Douglas, had his battles with addiction, public shame, and the deep scars of a troubled upbringing. The comparison between Michael and Rob's experiences as fathers and friends was a striking one. While Michael had to make the agonizing decision to draw lines and enforce boundaries with his own son, Rob was unable to do the same. Michael's decisions, though heartbreaking, ultimately saved his son's life. Rob, on the other hand, clung to the idea of unconditional love for his son, Nick, believing that his affection could fix everything. This, however, became Rob's undoing. Michael confessed that, years ago, he had warned Rob about the destructive consequences of enabling Nick's behavior, urging him to set boundaries before it was too late. But Rob, like many parents in his situation, was unwilling to face the harsh reality. As Douglas explained, it wasn't just that Rob's son was out of control. It was the insidious way that Nick manipulated his parents. For years, Rob and his wife, Michelle, had been subjected to a cycle of emotional blackmail. Nick had access to the family's wealth and resources, and used it as leverage to control his parents. He threatened to harm himself, to disappear, or to leak damaging stories if he did not get what he wanted. This created a toxic dynamic that no one dared to confront, and it was one that ultimately led to tragedy. Douglas's words were chilling when he recounted a visit to the set of a film in 2014, where he witnessed the stark transformation in Rob's demeanor when Nick appeared. Rob, once a confident director who had commanded the respect of the industry, seemed to shrink in the presence of his son. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Rob was no longer the patriarch. He was the broken man, the one who feared disappointing his son. Michael described how the atmosphere on set changed the moment Nick arrived, and how Rob physically recoiled when Nick walked into the room. It was a painful sight, one that no one outside the family could have fully understood. The most heartbreaking revelation, however, came when Michael described his last conversation with Rob. It was a conversation that took place in the privacy of a trailer, away from the prying eyes of the set. Rob had admitted that Nick was going through a tough time and that they needed to help him. But the truth, Michael realized, was that Rob was in denial. He was clinging to the hope that love could heal everything, even when the reality was that his son was beyond help, at least in the way that Rob was trying to offer it. Michael described the profound helplessness he felt as he tried to warn Rob about the dangers of his enabling behavior. But Rob remained stubborn, unwilling to let go of his dream that one day, things would improve. This tragic cycle of hope and denial was something Michael knew all too well. He had seen it play out in his own life, and he understood how difficult it was to set boundaries with someone you love. But he also knew that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save lives. Rob, unfortunately, never came to terms with the reality of his situation. His son's manipulation and the toxic love he offered ultimately led to a tragic end. Michael's testimony was not just a reflection of Rob's struggles. It was also a stark warning about the dangers of enabling destructive behavior in the name of love. As Michael shared the details of Rob's final days, he did not shy away from addressing the uncomfortable truths. He spoke of the emotional toll that Rob's denial had on him and how it affected everyone around him. The last years of Rob's life were marked by an escalating sense of dread as he faced the inevitable collapse of his family. Michael, though deeply pained by his friend's downfall, was also frustrated by the silence that surrounded the situation. The people around Rob, including those in Hollywood, had allowed this toxic cycle to continue for far too long. And now, Michael was determined to make sure that Rob's story would not be reduced to a simple tragedy. This was a man who had given the world so much: laughter, humanity, and unforgettable films. And yet, in the end, he was left alone, trapped in a house that once symbolized success but had now become a prison. The tragedy of Rob Reiner was not just that he died, but that he died in silence, having failed to confront the most painful truth of all: that love, when it is toxic and enabling, can be the very thing that destroys us. In the end, Michael Douglas's story about his dear friend was not just a tribute to a lost friend. It was a call to action. It was a reminder that we must face the truth, even when it is difficult, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. The heartbreaking truth that Michael Douglas unveiled about Rob Reiner's final years did not stop with his warnings and reflections on their personal lives. As the revelation deepened, it became clear that Rob's struggles were not just a tragic story of a father and son torn apart by addiction and neglect. They were also a glaring reflection of the silent, dangerous dynamics that can unfold behind the polished facades of Hollywood families. While many outsiders may have only seen Rob Reiner as the successful director who brought iconic films like The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally to life, Michael's insights into their friendship painted a much more complex and heartbreaking picture. Rob was not simply a man who had made it big in Hollywood. He was a man weighed down by the burden of his legacy, the expectations placed upon him by his father, Carl Reiner, and the unrelenting need to protect a family at all costs, even when that protection was slowly eroding everything he held dear. Michael Douglas's friendship with Rob spanned decades. Their shared experiences as sons of Hollywood icons and as fathers trying to navigate the treacherous waters of parenthood and the public eye brought them close. They shared a bond not just through their work, but through their personal lives. Michael had always admired Rob's ability to stand firm, but what he didn't realize at the time was just how much Rob had been struggling in silence. In the years leading up to Rob's death, it wasn't just Rob's relationship with his son that became a point of deep concern. There were whispers in Hollywood, behind closed doors, about the toll his personal life was taking on him. The warm, genial persona that the public had come to love was beginning to crack, but the stories behind those cracks were hidden, veiled in secrecy. What most did not know was that Rob had been, for years, battling the harsh reality that his son, Nick, had become unmanageable. The boy whom he had once loved unconditionally had become a source of immense pain, frustration, and eventually, tragedy. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling of a life that once seemed full of promise. Nick Reiner, in his early years, was a bright, promising young man who seemed destined to carve out his own path. But as time passed, the weight of family expectations, personal demons, and a growing addiction to substances took a devastating toll. Michael described how Rob had become increasingly withdrawn as he tried to navigate the tension between his love for Nick and the reality of his son's destructive behavior. But the cost of his enabling love was too high, and it was Michael's words that struck a nerve with Rob, though too late to make a difference. As Michael continued, The pain of watching his dear friend struggle became evident. Rob was caught in a cycle of hope and despair, believing that his love for his son would somehow bring him back, save him from the brink. But Michael, having walked through similar fires with his own son, knew the importance of setting boundaries. He knew that love, when it veers into unhealthy territory, could do more harm than good. Yet Rob's refusal to face the truth was something Michael had been trying to warn him about for years. There were moments when Michael watched Rob's battle unfold in silence, and he could see the toll it was taking on him. The late-night phone calls, the desperate pleas for help, the conversations about Nick's future, all of it was building up to something tragic. But it wasn't just the family that was being torn apart. Michael began to notice the ripple effect of Rob's personal turmoil on his career, his friends, and even the Hollywood community he had once dominated. His ability to direct with such precision, his charisma, and his legendary presence on set began to fade as the pressure of his home life overwhelmed him. Michael's recollections of visiting Rob on set, where everything seemed outwardly normal, painted a chilling picture. He spoke about how on one particular day, Rob had been so physically withdrawn, so mentally exhausted, that it was hard for Michael to comprehend what his friend was going through. The director, who once held so much power in Hollywood, now found himself physically shrinking in the presence of his son. It was a moment of complete emotional vulnerability that shook Michael to his core. But it wasn't just the physical transformation of Rob that Michael described. It was the psychological toll of being in a situation where love was weaponized against him. Michael witnessed firsthand how Rob, despite his best efforts, could not bring himself to break free from the toxic cycle that Nick had created. The toll of enabling Nick, of refusing to draw a line, was taking away everything that had once made Rob the man he was. Michael believed that had Rob drawn that line, had he set firm boundaries with Nick, things might have turned out differently. But the sad reality was that Rob's constant belief in the possibility of a better future for his son kept him trapped, and by the time he finally began to confront the severity of the situation, it was too late. One of the most disturbing elements of Michael's revelation was the role that Hollywood played in enabling this destructive cycle. Michael spoke about the system that allowed families like the Reiners to hide behind their wealth and status, to avoid confronting the harsh realities that others might have had to face. Hollywood, for all its glitter and glamour, had a dark side, one that protected its stars, but often at the cost of their families. Michael described how the support network around Rob and Michelle, though well-intentioned, often failed to intervene when it mattered most. Instead, they allowed the Reiner family's troubles to fester in the background, brushing them aside as if they were just another Hollywood tragedy to be ignored. The result of this toxic enablement was the unraveling of Rob's life. But it wasn't just the personal destruction that was at the heart of Michael's testimony. It was the deep sadness that came with knowing that Rob had never been able to break free from the destructive love he had for his son. The love that had once been a source of strength for Rob had, over time, become his greatest weakness, and Michael Douglas, despite all his experience, was left with a sense of helplessness as he reflected on what could have been done differently. Michael's words became a sharp critique of the system that had allowed Rob to suffer in silence for so long. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a societal failure, one that had allowed a talented man to drown under the weight of his own inability to set boundaries. As he closed his reflections, Michael left the world with a stark warning about the dangers of enabling toxic love and the consequences that come when we refuse to confront the painful truths that lie within our families. The aftermath of Rob Reiner's death was not only a moment of personal loss for those close to him, but also became a public reckoning with the consequences of years of silence and denial. Michael Douglas's deep connection with Rob allowed him to see beyond the headlines, beyond the tragedy that was so readily consumed by the media, into the painful layers of what led to Rob's demise. While the loss was felt deeply, it also shed light on the systemic issues at play, issues that were often hidden behind the glamour and power of Hollywood. The tragic ending of Rob's life was, in many ways, the culmination of a long and slow unraveling. While many assumed it was a sudden, violent outburst of rage or mental instability, Michael was quick to emphasize that the reality was much more complicated. It wasn't just a sudden break. It was a culmination of years of neglect, emotional manipulation, and a failure to confront the truth. Rob's ability to direct others, to lead as the patriarch of his family, had eroded over time, and it wasn't just his professional life that suffered as a result. It was his personal life, his relationships, and ultimately his sense of self-worth. Michael Douglas's reflections revealed the deep, emotional toll that Rob's death had on those who loved him. It wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was the loss of someone who had been battling with the reality of his family's dysfunction, someone who had struggled to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming despair. The tragedy was not just that Rob died, but that he died feeling as though he had failed his family. The battle he fought, the one that ultimately consumed him, was not one that he could win alone. It was a battle against addiction, manipulation, and an inability to let go of the hope that love alone could heal everything. For Michael, the aftermath of Rob's death was deeply personal. He was forced to confront the painful reality of their friendship and the ways in which he had failed to intervene. Michael spoke of the guilt he felt for not doing more, for not forcing Rob to see the truth sooner. He recalled moments when he tried to warn Rob, tried to get him to see that love could not save Nick from himself. But those moments were lost in the shuffle of years of denial. Michael's sense of responsibility as a friend and as a father weighed heavily on him in the aftermath of Rob's death. He felt as though he had failed his friend, even though he had done everything he could within his power. The emotional fallout was not confined to just Michael and the Reiner family. The tragedy of Rob's death was also a wake-up call for the Hollywood community. Rob had been a beloved figure in the industry, a director whose films had shaped the landscape of American cinema. His passing left a void not only in the hearts of those who knew him personally, but also in the collective memory of the industry he had helped build. Hollywood, for all its glitz and glamour, was not immune to the same struggles that plagued ordinary families. The toxic dynamics within Rob's home mirrored the dysfunction that many people faced in their own lives, and it was a sobering reminder of how easily success and fame could mask the deeper, darker issues at play behind closed doors. The public reaction to Rob's death was predictable. Headlines focused on the scandalous aspects of the story, the troubled son, the family secrets, the tragedy that unfolded in private. But Michael Douglas was determined to shift the narrative. He didn't want Rob to be remembered solely for the sensational aspects of his life. He wanted people to understand the complexities of Rob's story, the emotional pain he had endured, and the failure of the system that allowed it to continue for so long. Michael's insistence on speaking the truth, even at the cost of his own discomfort, was a powerful reminder of the importance of confronting difficult realities and breaking the silence that often surrounds family dysfunction. As Michael continued to reflect on Rob's life and death, he realized that the tragedy extended beyond Rob's own personal struggles. It was a reflection of the societal norms and pressures that shaped Hollywood's approach to family, success, and fame. In a world where perfection is often idolized, with a public eye scrutinizes every aspect of a person's life, the pressure to maintain an image of success can be overwhelming. For Rob, this pressure only intensified the emotional struggles he faced, and it ultimately contributed to the tragic end of his life. Hollywood, Michael pointed out, had failed to acknowledge the importance of setting boundaries, of dealing with mental health issues, and of addressing the toxic dynamics that exist within families. The lasting impact of Rob's death wasn't just the grief felt by those who knew him, but the broader conversation it sparked about the hidden realities of life in the spotlight. Michael Douglas's story was not just a personal tribute to a friend. It was a call for change. It was a plea for society, particularly those in positions of power, to take a hard look at the systems that enable dysfunction and to recognize the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths. The consequences of failing to do so were far-reaching, affecting not just the individual, but also those around them. As Michael continued to reflect on Rob's life, He came to the painful conclusion that Rob's death was preventable. If only the people around him had intervened earlier, if only the systems in place had provided more support, things might have turned out differently. But the failure to intervene, to address the root causes of Rob's struggles, ultimately led to a tragic end. Michael's words were a poignant reminder that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save lives, and that love, when unchecked, can sometimes do more harm than good. In the wake of Rob's death, Michael Douglas became a vocal advocate for change within Hollywood and beyond. He called on the industry to take responsibility for the way it handled family dynamics, addiction, and mental health. He spoke out against the culture of silence that had allowed Rob's struggles to fester, and he urged others to break the cycle of denial that had taken root in so many families. His message was clear: we must confront the painful realities of life, even when it is uncomfortable, because only then can we begin to heal. The legacy of Rob Reiner's death, as told through Michael Douglas's powerful reflections, was a stark reminder of the need for greater awareness, understanding, and intervention when it comes to family struggles. It was a call to action for anyone who had the power to make a difference. And it was a plea for people to stop turning a blind eye to the painful truths that often lie hidden beneath the surface. Only by confronting these issues head-on can we hope to break the cycles of dysfunction and pain that so often define the lives of those we admire. As Michael Douglas continued to reflect on his relationship with Rob Reiner and the tragic events that led to his friend's death, he found himself confronted with an even deeper layer of the story: the untold moments of Rob's life that had remained hidden from the public eye. These were the quiet, intimate moments that few people knew about, the struggles, the private conversations, the efforts to find peace amidst the chaos. Michael's revelations were not just about the public tragedy, but about the silent battles that Rob fought behind closed doors. One of the most poignant aspects of Rob's life, as Michael described, was the complexity of his inner world, which was shaped by a combination of love, guilt, and fear. Rob had been a loving father and a devoted husband, yet the very love that drove him to protect his family also led him into the trap of enabling destructive behavior. Michael spoke about how Rob had been trapped in a cycle of hope, believing that his love for Nick could save him, but unable to accept that sometimes love, no matter how unconditional, cannot fix everything. This was a painful reality that Michael understood all too well, having faced similar struggles with his own son. But what Michael also revealed was the more personal, emotional side of Rob that few had ever seen. Behind the director who had crafted iconic films and the public figure who had been adored by fans, there was a man who felt deep pain and regret. Michael shared stories of quiet moments he had shared with Rob, where they would talk not about work or Hollywood, but about life, their families, their children, the pressures of being in the spotlight. In those moments, Rob had often opened up about his fears, his struggles with being a father, and his concerns for Nick. But those conversations, though filled with deep emotion, were also filled with a sense of helplessness. Rob was a man who had been doing everything in his power to protect his son, but in the end, that very effort was what led to his undoing. It was clear from Michael's account that Rob's desire to protect his son had consumed him in ways that no one outside the family could truly understand. While the public saw the successful director, the beloved figure in Hollywood, Michael saw a man who was constantly on edge, living in fear of the inevitable moment when his son's destructive behavior would finally tear the family apart. Michael recounted a specific moment when Rob admitted to him that he was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Rob had confessed that he no longer recognized the person his son had become, and that he was haunted by the thought that, despite all his efforts, he had failed Nick. But the most heart-wrenching aspect of these private conversations was Rob's sense of guilt. He felt as though he had failed not only as a father, but also as a husband. Michael spoke about how Rob had confided in him about the toll his family's struggles had taken on his relationship with Michelle. The tension between them had grown over the years, and while Rob had always tried to protect Michelle from the worst of it, he could not escape the truth that their marriage had become strained. Michael's insight into their relationship painted a picture of a man who was torn between his loyalty to his wife and his desire to fix the damage done to his son. Rob had become so consumed with trying to save Nick that he had neglected the emotional needs of those closest to him. It was in these quiet moments of confession, these vulnerable exchanges between friends, that Michael began to understand just how deeply Rob was suffering. Michael realized that, in many ways, Rob had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had been trying to balance his public persona, his career, and his family life, all while silently battling with the demons that his son had brought into their home. Michael also spoke about the guilt he felt as he watched his friend slowly crumble under the pressure. He knew that, despite their deep friendship, he had never fully understood the depth of Rob's pain until it was too late. These untold stories were the ones that Michael believed needed to be shared. They were the ones that painted a fuller picture of who Rob really was, a man who had given everything for his family, but whose love, in the end, had become a double-edged sword. Michael's reflections on these moments were both heartbreaking and illuminating. They showed that, for all of Rob's outward success, he had been just as human, just as vulnerable as anyone else. And it was in these untold stories, these quiet battles, that the true tragedy of Rob's life unfolded. As Michael continued to share his memories of Rob, it became clear that the story of his friend's life was far more complex than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just about the tragedy of his death, but about the deeper emotional struggles that had defined his life. Michael's account was not just a eulogy for a fallen friend, but a powerful reminder of the fragility of the human experience. It was a call to recognize the often unseen battles that people fight in silence, and to understand that even the most successful and adored individuals are not immune to the pain and struggles that come with being human. The stories that Michael shared were a testament to the complexity of Rob Reiner's life. They were stories of love, guilt, fear, and ultimately, the devastating consequences of enabling behavior. They were the untold moments that had been hidden from the public eye, but that Michael felt needed to be heard. And as he shared these intimate glimpses into his friend's life, Michael hoped that the world would finally understand the true cost of love when it becomes toxic, when it is used to enable destructive behavior rather than heal it. As Michael Douglas continued his reflections on Rob Reiner's life and death, he began to wrestle with the deeper implications of the story. Beyond the personal grief and the raw emotions of losing a dear friend, Michael understood that Rob's life, and ultimately his death, held lessons that went far beyond the realm of Hollywood. It was a poignant reminder of the human cost of fame, the struggles that many people face in silence, and the dangers of allowing love to blind us to the truth. One of the key themes that Michael kept coming back to was the idea of legacy. Rob had achieved so much in his career. He was a celebrated director, a man who had shaped the landscape of American cinema with films that became cultural touchstones. Yet, as Michael pondered his friend's legacy, he came to the painful realization that Rob's final chapter would not be remembered solely for the films he made or the laughter he inspired. Instead, it would be remembered for the tragedy that unfolded behind the scenes, the quiet suffering that no one could have predicted. Michael reflected on the idea that, despite all the accolades and achievements, Rob's greatest legacy might be the lessons his life left behind. The story of Rob Reiner's downfall was not one of sudden tragedy, but of a long and painful journey filled with missed opportunities, broken relationships, and the inability to break free from destructive cycles. For Michael, this was the most difficult part to process. The realization that Rob's inability to let go of the hope that things could be fixed, that love could heal everything, was ultimately what led to his demise. But as much as Michael mourned the loss of his friend, he also saw a larger, more universal truth in Rob's life and death. It was a truth that spoke to the ways in which people often refuse to face uncomfortable realities, how they cling to hope even when it is no longer warranted, and how they sometimes allow the very things they love to destroy them. Rob's story, in many ways, was a warning to others, a lesson about the importance of setting boundaries, confronting the truth, and not allowing one's love for another to become enabling. Michael couldn't help but think about the wider societal implications of Rob's story. The pressures of fame and the burdens of being constantly under the microscope were challenges that many in Hollywood faced, but it wasn't just the glitz and glamour of the industry that had impacted Rob. It was the toxic dynamics within his own family that had been the most destructive. Michael reflected on how the industry itself, despite its progressive image, often failed to address the very human issues that plagued so many of its stars. Mental health, addiction, and family dysfunction were all too often swept under the rug in favor of maintaining a pristine public image. Rob's life, in many ways, was a reflection of this failure to confront the uncomfortable truths that lay just beneath the surface. As he pondered Rob's legacy, Michael found himself grappling with the question of what it truly meant to be a hero. Rob, in many ways, had been a hero to the people he loved. He had been a supportive friend, a devoted father, and a man who cared deeply about his family. Yet, in the end, his inability to set boundaries, to let go of the destructive patterns that defined his relationship with Nick, left him vulnerable to a tragic fate. Michael realized that, in many ways, Rob had sacrificed himself in the name of love, but that sacrifice had come at a terrible cost. This was where Michael saw the greatest tragedy of all. It wasn't just that Rob had been caught in a cycle of dysfunction with his son. It was that he had allowed himself to be consumed by it, unable to escape the grip of love that had become both his strength and his downfall. Michael saw this as a warning to others, particularly those who were struggling with similar issues in their own lives. The message was clear: love, when it is enabling and unchecked, can become toxic. It can blind us to the truth, and it can ultimately destroy us. Michael's reflections on Rob's life and legacy were a sobering reminder that even the most successful, admired individuals are not immune to the struggles that plague so many of us. Rob's story was not one of simple triumph and tragedy, but of the complexities of human relationships, the messiness of love, and the consequences of ignoring the warning signs of self-destructive behavior. As Michael shared his thoughts, he hoped that others would learn from Rob's story, that they would recognize the dangers of enabling toxic behavior, and that they would find the strength to set boundaries and confront the difficult truths in their own lives before it was too late. In the end, Michael's reflections on Rob's legacy were not just about the life he had lived or the death he had suffered, but about the lessons that could be learned from his story. Rob's life had been full of laughter, creativity, and love, but had also been marked by deep pain, unresolved conflicts, and a failure to confront the realities that ultimately destroyed him. Michael hoped that Rob's story would serve as a cautionary tale, one that would inspire others to take a hard look at their own lives and relationships, and to make the difficult choices that might save them from the same tragic fate. As he closed his reflections, Michael Douglas left the world with a message that was both heartbreaking and profound. Rob's story was not just about a man who had suffered, but about a man who had given everything for the people he loved, only to be undone by the very love he thought could save them. It was a reminder that, in the end, love alone is not enough. It must be tempered with boundaries, truth, and self-preservation. Without these, even the most well-intentioned love can become a destructive force that leaves nothing but pain in its wake. As Michael Douglas wrapped up his reflections on Rob Reiner's life and death, he found himself standing at a crossroads between grief and the haunting knowledge that Rob's story had become more than just a personal loss. It was a cautionary tale that transcended the realm of Hollywood, reaching into the very heart of human relationships, family dynamics, and the pitfalls of love. For Michael, this was not just a story of a friend he had lost, but a painful reminder of the fragility of human beings and the devastating consequences of ignoring the hard truths we often refuse to confront. In the final moments of his tribute to Rob, Michael emphasized the importance of acknowledging the silent, underlying issues that so often go unnoticed until it is too late. The silence that had surrounded Rob's struggle with his son, Nick, was not just a personal failure. It was a societal one. It was a failure to address the complexity of addiction, family dysfunction, and mental health in an industry that often celebrated success at the expense of deeper emotional wounds. The very system that allowed Rob to thrive professionally had also enabled the toxic dynamics in his personal life to flourish unchecked. Michael's words were a wake-up call to all who heard them, a call to examine the systems that allowed these destructive cycles to continue and to take responsibility for the ways in which we enable unhealthy behavior, whether in our families or in society as a whole. Rob's death, as painful as it was, became a powerful reminder that, in order to truly honor someone's legacy, we must look beyond their accomplishments and confront the difficult, uncomfortable truths that may have contributed to their downfall. For Michael, this meant acknowledging the deep impact that Rob's death had on him personally, but also understanding the larger significance of the story. Rob's legacy, as Michael saw it, was not just about the films he made, but about the lessons his life and death offered to others. It was about recognizing the dangers of unchecked love, the importance of setting boundaries, and the necessity of confronting our own weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Rob had lived his life in the shadow of his father's legacy, and in the end, he had been consumed by his desire to protect his son at all costs. But Michael knew that Rob's greatest legacy would not be defined by the roles he played on screen, but by the lessons his life offered to others who might be struggling with similar issues. The final moments of Michael's tribute were filled with a sense of both closure and unresolved pain. He understood that Rob's death was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a larger conversation about the way we approach family, love, and the complexities of human relationships. Michael's reflections were not just about grief, but about a deeper understanding of the human condition. They were about the need to break the silence surrounding difficult topics, to stop enabling destructive behavior, and to take responsibility for the impact we have on those around us. As Michael concluded, he offered a message to the world, that the death of Rob Reiner, while tragic, was not in vain. It was a reminder to all of us that love is not always enough. That love, when it is toxic, can destroy just as easily as it can heal. And that sometimes the greatest act of love we can offer is not to continue enabling destructive behavior, but to set boundaries, to confront the truth, and to protect ourselves and our loved ones from harm. Michael's words were a call to action, not just for those in Hollywood, but for anyone who has ever struggled with the complexities of family dynamics, addiction, or the burden of love. They were a reminder that, while love is powerful, it is not invincible. And sometimes, the hardest thing we can do is to step back, take a hard look at the situation, and make the difficult choices that will ultimately lead to healing, both for ourselves and for those we care about. The final message of Michael's tribute was one of reflection and hope, a hope that, through the pain of Rob's loss, others might find the strength to break free from their own cycles of enabling, denial, and silence. It was a message about the importance of speaking out, of confronting the hard truths, and of recognizing that love, while vital, must be tempered with responsibility, boundaries, and self-awareness. As the story of Rob Reiner's life and death came to a close, Michael Douglas left the world with a poignant reminder that, in the end, it is not our successes that define us, but how we face the challenges and struggles that life throws our way. Rob's story, as tragic as it was, offered valuable lessons for all who were willing to listen, and Michael's heartfelt tribute ensured that Rob's legacy would continue to inspire and challenge those who heard it. It was a legacy that would live on, not just in the films he made, but in the lessons his life and death taught us all.